Hello, St. John's, and welcome to our first Lenten Sunday of 2021. I am Dr. Peter Scott Brown, and I am so pleased to get back with you here and talking about the windows of the Cathedral of St. John's. I am professor of art history at University of North Florida, and it has been my great pleasure to study the windows of St. John's Cathedral and this year to begin to share them with the congregation at the cathedral. In Advent, we spent 4 lessons on the Life of Christ windows in the nave. And today, kicking off Lent, we're going to begin discussion of a series of windows at the cathedral that treat theological rather than biographical themes. So our first window is a very appropriate window for Lent. It is the Works of Mercy window, which appears above the north entryway to the cathedral, a very appropriate position for it, as we'll see. The window over the north entrance of the cathedral, installed in 1957, depicts an ancient theme whose subject is the Christian imperative of mercy, ministry and service to those in need, known as the corporal works of mercy. These themes in the window occupy only a single register across the bottom of the window. And all of the pictorial content is depicted in the 7 lancet windows in this register. 4 separate subjects are depicted on either of the 2 sides of the center. As in our nativity windows, there's a main focus occupying the 3 central lancets, and 2 subjects appear to the left and to the right of this main subject. Subjects of the works of mercy in Christian art and theology dates back to the Gothic era, at least. The subject of the works of mercy was a common theme in the Gothic era, seen in windows at Freiburg, Munster, and the All Saints Church in York, for example. The center scene of our Works of Mercy window at St. John's depicts a large group of men and women of diverse ages, standing or kneeling around the figure of a sick man who is seated on his bed, his torso bare, clad only in a white winding sheet, rather like an ancient version of the modern hospital gown. The man's posture and attitude project an image of suffering, and a single crutch propped against his knee symbolizes his infirmity. A kneeling figure in the lancet to the right humbly bears forward a bowl and basin, perhaps to wash or tend to the sick man. And other figures stand around in attitudes of attentive sympathy and compassion or pity, while a man standing in red and gold in the center panel gestures toward the sufferer in a manner that establishes him within the composition as the moral object of the window's spiritual lesson. To the far left of the center scene, a standing figure here tips water from a small jug into the mouth of a half-clothed, suffering man. The rays of a brilliant sun, a palm tree, and a sand-colored hill in the background establish the setting of the scene in a desert. Adjacent to this lancet to the right, a standing male figure offers a morsel of food, perhaps a small loaf or of bread, to a kneeling woman. In the lancet to the right of the center scene, a standing figure drapes a green cloth around an otherwise naked man who kneels on the ground with his back to the viewer and his head lowered as if in shame. And in the last pane to the far right, a standing figure places his arm around the shoulders of a seated man, clad in a blue cloak, a gesture of comfort toward the disconsolate-looking man, wrapping his arms around his shoulders. The man in blue, meanwhile, clasps his hands in worry and lowers his face to the floor in an attitude of hopelessness. The castellated wall in the background with turrets and a gate-like aperture establish the scene as taking place in a prison. Beneath the 4 scenes, to the left and the right of center, An inscription supplies the spiritual moral of the larger window. Quote, "Inasmuch as ye've done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it to me." These words are quoted from Matthew 25:40, and the window's 5 main scenes illustrate the 6 works of mercy described by Christ in his words in Matthew 25:35 through 40, which foretells the final judgment. Quote, "Then the king will say to those on his right hand, 'Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and gave you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?' And then the king will answer them and say, 'Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of my brethren, you did it to me.'" From the left to the right, we see our lancet windows echo this biblical text in the images of the works of mercy, giving drink to the thirsty in the first one, giving food to the hungry in the second, visiting the sick and housing the stranger, which appear to be represented both here, drawn together in the image of caring for the sick and homeless man, clothing the naked, and finally, visiting those in prison. The center scene, as I said, appears to do double duty as a representation of both ministration to the sick and the housing of the homeless. Indeed, in the medieval past, these 2 acts of charity were largely inseparable. One of the foremost charitable works of the church in the Middle Ages was the administration of hospitals and hospices, which served both to house the sick and the homeless, who were often homeless because of illnesses like leprosy, which caused them to be outcasts. The works of mercy were also in the Catholic tradition or the universal church tradition of the Middle Ages, an incredibly important means of penitence and of the demonstration of faith and the justification of the soul of the individual and the expectation of judgment in the afterlife. These good works were prescribed by the church as duties of good Christians and of faithful Christians. We can see them, for instance, here in a medieval manuscript from the 14th century, where a man here on the right with a sword and dressed in fine costume, fine clothes, a gentleman, in other words, has had a kind of revelation, as we often have at a moment in our lives where we're seeking and lacking a spiritual center. This man realizes that he has possessions, he has wealth, he has status, but he does not have the comfort of knowing that his soul is healthy. And so he goes here to a wise man and he says, "What can I do? I'm rich and I'm wealthy and I am aristocratic and I have dignity and I have station in life, but I want something more." And so here the wise man, the monk, advises him that the way to cure his soul is to perform these good works. And they are illustrated here for us below, carrying food and drink here combined into a single image to the sick and to the thirsty, to the hungry and the thirsty, caring for travelers and those who have no home, clothing the naked, comforting and visiting the sick, as well as those here in prison. And in this case, burying the dead, which is added to this as one of the most important sacraments, one of the most important works of mercy. And then at the end, we see the man who started off as the wealthy aristocratic gentleman, here clad in the garments of of the pious monk, the man who has repented of his worldly ways and sought a meaning for his life in spiritual works. And he dies on his deathbed here, but his soul is received by angels and carried to God in heaven. These are very much the prescriptive images of the works of mercy in the Middle Ages. We see here, as in the Freiburg Munster, which I mentioned earlier, a stained glass window like our own, presenting the 6 works of mercy, including here comforting those in prison and housing the homeless and comforting the sick, clothing those who are naked. These works of mercy became controversial, however, in the Reformation, which is an important story for our own faith and for all of the Protestant faiths. The works of mercy had an almost sacramental power in the medieval theology and were equated with spiritual virtue. That is, to do these works was the way to be close to God, as we see here in the Works of Mercy altarpiece by the Master of Alkmaar from 1504, just before the Reformation. The images of, again, as we've seen, feeding and watering and clothing and burying, housing, comforting both the sick and the imprisoned, is presented here in an image in which, in the center, the Last Judgment itself, the image of Christ in Apocalypse, appears to us with seated in heaven and his feet on the globe of the earth, flanked by John the Baptist and the Virgin Mary. He is there to judge the living and the dead according to their works. This image of doing good works was, for the people of the Middle Ages, equivalent to the experience of salvation. It was a means to salvation, which was rejected by Luther and the reformers in the early Reformation, in who the reforming theologians believed very strongly that one was saved by faith alone. Luther held that you should do good works because it's right to do good works. But he hesitated and in fact pushed back against the idea that doing good works was a means into heaven, that there was a mechanistic relationship between doing this thing on earth and demonstrating your faith in God and thus preparing your soul for salvation. On the other hand, Reformation Europe was a place that was in tremendous socioeconomic and demographic change. As urban cities grew and proto-industrial processes took hold in the European economy, there was a greater disparity, perhaps than ever before in European life, between the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy, the sick, the poor, and those who had all of their needs met. There was more than ever before a need, just as the destabilizing effects of the Reformation called the power of the Catholic Church into question, there was a need for the good works that had traditionally been done by the monks and the monasteries and the religious confraternities that provided for the poor, the homeless, sick, orphans. The works of mercy thus continued to be an extremely important artistic subject, even as they ceased to be a part of the dominant religious ideology of the 16th century. We see here in a work from the Netherlands, a Protestant country, a painting now taken out of its religious context and a secular image of the works of mercy, an image that promotes the goal of doing good because it is right to do good, apart from the central question of the fate of our souls. We see all 7 of the traditional works here included, giving to the poor, and feeding and watering, comforting the sick, visiting those who are imprisoned in the background, housing the homeless and travelers. In a work by Peter Bruegel the Elder from the same era, we see the same thing. It is, however, an image that presents us with altogether in one picture, the kind of vision of an urban society in crisis, where there are those who have. There is plenty of bread and plenty to drink. There are fine houses, but where many people suffer, many people are poor and deprived. There is thus, in the later Reformation, a return to the idea of the works of mercy, and in many of the Protestant sects, a return theologically to the idea of the central importance of the works of mercy, including especially, for instance, in the writings and thinking of John Wesley and the early Methodist movement. As we see here, in one final example, a Flemish image that really comments on the socioeconomic and demographic issues, the realities that confronted people of the 16th century, much as they confront us today, of the tremendous disparity in wealth and of access that existed in this proto-industrial early modern society, one that is sort of the beginning point for our own society. In this image, we see the sick cared for in the front, an image that evokes the 7 works of mercy. And in the background, we see a biblical parable unfolding in front of us. In a fine house, a palace really almost, there's a rich man with his wife seated at a table served by servants, while outside at his door, a poor leper with only a dog for comfort lies and begs and receives nothing from the rich man. This is the parable we often refer to as Lazarus and Dives, or Lazarus in the rich man in the Gospels. And the rich man is a man who, by his works, dooms himself to hell and to punishment. And we see here the figure of the devil waving a red banner, preparing to carry off the soul of the rich man to the fires of hell on the right, while the soul of Lazarus goes to heaven. It's a reminder then, in a very interesting socioeconomic reflection on contemporary society, of the problems of disparities of wealth and of conditions of access. One that reminds us in our own world of the importance of these issues facing us today. In our St. John's Cathedral, the Works of Mercy window is over the entryway to the cathedral, in the north entry. So we see it as we go in and as we leave. Now, of course, the windows shine brighter when we're on the inside. That's the nature of stained glass windows. The light floods in while we're inside the cathedral. So as we leave, we're presented with this image that sends us out into the world to do good. And the Works of Mercy window at St. John's offers us a timeless reminder in this way of the miseries and misfortunes that affect human society. They are no different today than they were in the time of Christ and the disciples. Poverty, hunger, thirst, privation, homelessness, illness, bondage, and imprisonment are the scourges of the modern world as much as they were of the ancient or the medieval. They remain thus at the center of the church's ministry and of its charitable and humanitarian mission. Every well dug in a dry land by the church's missionaries, every bed and supper at Clara White, the church's hospitals, its prison ministries, ministry to the sick and dying, all of these embody the unending duty of mercy that Christ described for his followers. These works of mercy serve as reminders of the message of Matthew 25, that as the neediest among us deserve mercy and compassion, we also hope for mercy and compassion ourselves when our own moment of need and judgment arrives. So, very appropriate themes for this first Sunday in Lent. And I hope that you will all join me again next week when we return to the windows of St. John's. Have a wonderful day, everyone.